Hello, this is Dr. Carol Billing from the University of Idaho, and I want to cover briefly, one theory on learner development. This is actually like trying to condense an entire semester in a 5-minute PowerPoint, but I'm going to give it a try. It's just going to give you something to think about as you're heading into your school year and you're creating some lesson plans and stuff, is to think about how students learn and how they perceive and process information. So, while I know you can put PowerPoint into the presentation mode or what have you, I'm going to leave it here because I'm going to jump between the slides a little bit. I want to introduce you to a theory. It's called Kolb Cycle of Experiential Learning. And so it's based on feeling, how you perceive something and how you process information, and then how you learn information. So it's kind of like 3 layers. So if you think of the first layer as how do people perceive, they either have a concrete experience, have a real experience, or they think something through abstractly. And so that's your axis, vertical axis. They process information by either doing it or watching it, right? We all have kids who will watch something, and we all have kids who insist on doing it. I think you get my idea there. So those are the 2 axes of the theory. If those 2 parts are the center, then on the outside you have how learning happens, right? So you have interpretation of existing experience. You will reflect on your experience and your understanding. You'll do some abstract conceptualization, and that creates a new idea, or you'll actively experiment. You will hands-on try them and see what happens. So here is the framework. So this feeling and doing is right here. Feeling and thinking is right here. And then you have the processing, doing and watching, doing and watching. So this is how the processing and the perception is developed. And then in the center is what the learning styles are kind of created. So if you're someone who prefers to watch and think, you're considered a theorist. And if you're a person who likes to do and then think, you're more of a pragmatist. And we all have that favorite friend who likes to do and feel. They don't want to think or watch. They want to do and feel it now. And that's your activist. Those are often the funnest people, right? Are the most fun? Oh my gosh, did I just use improper grammar? Okay, and then we have the feeling and watching, and these are our reflectors, right? There are kids who watch and think about it, watch and try it. Okay. Your theorists are your ones that you can't get off the sofa because they're watching and they're thinking and they're watching and they're thinking, and you're thinking, I really need to pair it with an activist. But you have to be careful if you do that. One of the things that's great about knowing these sort of frameworks exist or understanding how they are, if you can take your students and figure out who your activists are, who your reflectors are, and they might not be purely in one box, but if you kind of have them somewhat in the area, like maybe, so this is me, because I'm a total tactile person, teacher. I would put the name of every kid in my class on a popsicle stick. I would print this out, put it on my desk, and then I would place each popsicle stick on the circle of where that kid acts or how that kid learns. So I might have someone that's totally an activist. This is a kid, I can't keep them in their chair, and they want to do and think, and they don't want to watch or think, they want to feel and do. They don't want to watch or think. They don't want to hear me talk about the process of whatever we're going to do. They just want to go. And they're going to sit right there. But maybe I've got a kid down here he's still in that realm, but he thinks more about things. Or I have one over here that likes to watch more. So I end up with sort of this popsicle sticks sun that where I can sort of see where my kids are within these 4 areas. And the reason why I would do that, besides it's interesting, is for pairing or for grouping. So maybe I take a kid that's in the activist area but is kind of here down with doing, put them with a strong doer. I'll throw a theorist in there because I can't put a theorist with like 4 activists because that poor child will explode or implode. And then maybe add 1 reflector kind of kid or a reflector that's close to being an activist. So anyway, you can think about, this is a great way to start putting your groupings together with students and figuring out which ones are effective. And I found once I could group kids together effectively, that made my life so much easier as an instructor, but it also made the class much more fun for the students, and they learned more because they weren't put in a group where they were such the odd man out in the way that they either processed, perceived, or how they learned the content. It wasn't so different from the other kids in the group. So anyway, sidebar a little bit there. Here's the descriptions. So divergent, prefers to watch rather than do, assimilating, thinks it through, converging, likes technical and problem solving. So converging was this. Okay, right here, sorry. Yeah, it's between doing and thinking. So they do want to think about it, but they also want to get their hands on it. And then accommodating, which is intuition rather than logic, carries out other plans and instructions. So accommodating is right here. So that is your activist. Okay, so that's something to think about as you're moving towards your lesson work. The other point I want to cover with you briefly, I'm 6 minutes in, so I'm watching my time, is the goal is always to have the student a partner in their learning. They need to have some skin in the game, and they need to have a reason for wanting to be there and to learn what you're doing. So their reason for being in that chair may not have their own reason for being in your classroom. Aside from it's what class they could fit in 5th period. But your job is to take your content and make it applicable to them. So how does it align to their past experiences? How can they have relevance? How can it have relevance for them? An example of this is I taught technology. I would teach Excel. Excel is a little dry. So I would have them do a budgeting assignment where they picked their dream job, their dream house, and their dream car, and they figured out what those things cost. And then they, or what, the house and the car cost. And then they figured out what they would make with their dream job. So in doing that, they got to dream, they got to be interested, and they were invested in the assignment. And in the process, I also taught them how to do some basic online research for like life skills, as well as give them a reality check, which for some of the seniors, it was quite a reality check. And then technically, I taught them how to use Excel, how to use some basic formulas to create a P&L, a profit and loss statement. So I hope that as you're designing your lessons, you should always have something in there where you're asking a question to help those students connect either past experiences or future goals with whatever it is that you're teaching. How does it benefit them? All right. This is literally an entire semester in 8 minutes so far. Cone of learning. Love the cone of learning because it shows you up here when you give auditory instructions, verbal receiving, at best, you're up here in the 20% to 30% of retaining what they've heard, saw, or read. If your student is ADHD or has a low working memory or has executive functioning delays, and this, it's not even something you'll know when they walk through the door, right? I mean, if you're a parent and you have a child with ADHD, you're all over this because we live in this world every day. I live in this world every day with my sons. So, but when I was a teacher, I did not have children, and I did not know any of this. So, with verbal and auditory instructions, I had a special ed teacher tell me like 2 at most, Carol, or 3. But once you go beyond 3, forget it. They're not going to retain it. And so honestly, giving anyone a lot of verbal instructions is pretty tough expectation, but especially if you're trying to teach. I went to a lot of visual aids. So I would have what we're doing for the day available for students to see all the time, right? And some teachers put it on the board, write it on the whiteboard, whatever, but I had 6 different classes in a day. 7 periods, 6 different classes, 1 prep. A lot of times I took a nap because I was so tired on my prep. But anyway, there was not time for me to write it on the board between every class. I had 3 minutes between classes. I didn't have time. So I had a PowerPoint, and the kids could access the PowerPoint, and so they knew every single day what we were going to cover. And so it gave them the lay of the land, and it also gave them something to write notes on if they wanted to. And I didn't print hard copies. This was something they could access on a common drive. But if I had a student with low functioning working memory or executive functioning or ADHD and just couldn't stay with me, I would print my notes. I would print that PowerPoint for them, and I had to do it anyway because I was creating my lessons and creating my plan. I had to have an electronic copy to keep kids on track, but then I could also print it to keep my my ADD kids knowing where we're going, and not having to rely on that verbal receiving, giving them a visual. And you can see visual moves a little bit lower here on the list. So 50%, watching a movie, these are examples. But it's also like giving notes, giving a framework of what you're going to cover during the day, that kind of stuff. Coming down here, when you start getting into this active, receiving, participating, and doing, you're getting a greater return on investment. Quite frankly, you're going to teach and they're going to retain more of it. And down here at the very bottom, which they don't have, and I would absolutely add, is if you can get a student to reteach the content to another student, that student is going to retain, the student teacher is going to retain like 90% of whatever they taught. So anytime you can put kids in groupings where your middle functioning kids, which often are the more empathetic, they're more willing to work with the lower functioning kid than a kid that's really, really bright. A lot of times they're bored and they don't want to help other students. It's just not where they want it. They just want to go forward. They want to learn more. They want to absorb more, and they're bored, right? So those are your gay kids or your exceptional students. Anyway, if you can get kids to reteach other kids, especially if the way that you group them takes that middle achieving student and puts them in sort of a TA role, that student is going to really understand the content and grow as a student in so many ways beyond just the content that you're teaching them. So I wish that this triangle had teaching to peers on it, because that's just where you always hope to get them. So as you're teaching, just realize if you talk more than 5 minutes, which is, I've already done 13, so I've already lost you all, sadly, try to keep your talking down to 5 to 7 minutes tops, and then put them hands-on, because then you go from the passive to the active. Okay, last idea. This is a 30-second slide. Everybody perceives and learns differently. We know that. One of the keys to knowing how to teach your students is knowing your students. And it's not just about this person is auditory, this person's visual, this person is kinesthetic learner. It's knowing what motivates them. So if I have a student who's either a behavioral problem or I call them, they fly under the radar. Under the radar flying students, they're really quiet, they do all the work. You never hear from them, they never seek attention, and you tend not to give them attention because you're dealing with the kid that can't sit still, or the kid who's bored because he's unbelievably bright, and you're trying to accommodate, all these different levels. Anyway, so these students that are either behavioral or flying under the radar, I do what's called a 10 by 2. And this is 10 class meetings where I talk to just that kid for the first 2 minutes of class, and it's not related to content. So we talk about NASCAR, we talk about horses, we talk about whatever interests that kid. Because you start to create a rapport with that student, and then you see him outside the classroom, and you can have something to talk about that's not about classwork, and they start to see you as a person, which is helpful. But it also, I've never had this technique not work 1,000% in my favor. The kids that are behavioral problems become invested in how you feel. They care about how you feel. And when you can get that, then the behavioral problems often stop, or at least they're easier to manage. And I always know that a behavioral problem is manifested in a frustration, right? So if you get to know a kid, And then you figure out what the frustration is in your class, because it might be something at home, it might be the content of your class, it might be something social. I mean, there's all these different frustrations, but no matter what the frustration is, it's creating this behavior in your class. It's derailing your class. So once you get to know the kid, you understand the frustration, and you can either help with the frustration or you can just acknowledge it. And then they don't have to act out, or they don't have to have this behavior, because you're mitigating the frustration. So that was a lot in 2 seconds, but let me just recap real quick. Know your students. Know what motivates them, which also in turn helps you know what frustrates them, and that's going to help you with engagement and behavior in the classroom. Gosh, that was slick. There you go. That's what I wanted to cover in this slide. Okay, I'll check back with you on the next standard, and we can see what else we need to cover.